Well, hello and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. And I'm Steve Kubler, the organizer of the series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics here at UCF. And in today's event, we will explore what ethical AI looks like. Now, we all know the growth and implementation of AI is expanding and accelerating globally, and AI is finding itself in search engines, software, consumer support services, teaching and learning, self-driving vehicles, HR and hiring, medical diagnosis, industrial operations, military command and control, and more. It's an exhausting list. In Ethically Speaking today, we're going to take a step back and ask, how should our development in implementation and use of AI be informed by expertise and responsibility? And we're going to ask if there's any implicit or explicit right to refusal, particularly given that AI is increasingly and maybe irreversibly entrenched in so many aspects of our society and daily lives. Now, before we begin, I'm going to say a few things about our speaker series and how you can participate. Go ahead and share slides again. So Ethically Speaking is organized with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who's professor of ethics and digital culture and founding director of the UCF Center for Ethics. And he and I developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. And we encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. We're actually at the end of our series this spring, but we'll start again in fall. So pay attention to your email. I want to encourage everyone who attends to email me, please, with your suggestions. You can find my email and our other contact information on the website. We want to hear your topics for future Ethically Speaking events. Ethics connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives, and the importance of ethics at UCF, I hope, is clear from this long list of partners that I show who support the series. And all of us hope you enjoy the discussions here in Ethically Speaking. And we hope it cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. Okay, now to today's event. This is an exciting departure, I think, from our usual format. Instead of having just one speaker today, we're going to explore AI ethics with a panel-led discussion that includes all attendees. So we're going to need your help on this. As usual, our discussion will be led by our expert moderator, the incomparable Dr. Jonathan Beaver. See how much I've put on his shoulders. He'll briefly introduce our panelists and pose some short prompting questions that they can use to open up our discussion. Then we effectively add you to the panel by encouraging each of you to pose questions and share some of your positions as well. And Dr. Beaver will take us back and forth, as only he can do, between contributors and panelists to really explore those complex themes in something like a town hall format. So please keep in mind, our events are recorded, and we'll post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it and also share it with others. So now I think we're ready. I'll turn it over to Dr. Beaver to take us away.
Thanks, Dr. Kubler. This is always so fun for me, and thanks everybody for being here. As Dr. Kubler mentioned, we've got 5 panelists here. You can identify those because we all have the fancy AI ethics backgrounds in Zoom here that Dr. Kubler created for us. So again, what we're going to do is I'll introduce the 5 of us really briefly, and then I'll start us off by introducing the problem of the right to refusal as I see it, and then ask everybody to share their perspectives on the panel, and then open it up to the audience for questions. So we'll try to keep our introductions briefish, 3 to 5 minutes apiece, just to share our perspectives and let you get to know us a little bit. But I'm really grateful to my colleagues for being here. So Dr. Mason Cash from the Department of Philosophy is here on our panel. He's got interest in philosophy and cognitive science, especially about normative practices in human cognition and the ways those intersect with developing technologies like AI. He teaches courses on ethics and technologies, including around artificial intelligence and the impacts those technologies have on the future of humanity. I've also got Dr. Kubler, my colleague and the Associate Director of the Center for Ethics. And Dr. Kubler is coming to us from optics and chemistry and materials engineering, all joint appointments there. And he and his students use AI algorithms to optimize photonic devices, among other things. But as the Associate Director of the Center for Ethics, he regularly leads discussions with our graduate students and undergrad researchers in particular, around science and engineering questions, in particular lately about artificial intelligence. Also here with us is Carol Stinnett. Carol is a PhD candidate now in text and technology, working on the ethics of AI in marketing and advertising contexts, both in her dissertation and also professionally in industry. And last but not least is April Beer. April is a master's student in our data analytics AI track program in computer science and is interested in questions around artificial intelligence, data ownership, and evolving governance and regulatory landscape around artificial intelligence. And as Dr. Kibler mentioned, I'm Jonathan Beaver. I'm a professor of philosophy and text and technology and direct the Center for Ethics. And I've been thinking and writing and worrying about AI for some time. So I'll start us off with just a couple of thoughts because I've been thinking now for a bit of time about this problem of the right to refusal. There's some big picture questions here for me about where rights come from in the first place, and we might bracket that depending on the interest of the audience, but also how technologies impact our rights. And how do we interface with AI platforms and data centers that form material infrastructures of AI platforms regarding our rights? There are all kinds of reasons that you might be worried about artificial intelligence and might think, as I guess I'll admit that I think, we ought to take up the right to refusal more often. Those might be for environmental reasons, especially around the material impacts of data centers. Those might be justice reasons for unequal distribution of harms and benefits. Those might be data privacy reasons. Those might be academic freedom reasons. There's all kinds of work here around questions of who's responsible and what expertise should play in thinking about this resistance. But it was striking to me that after we came up with this panel and started thinking about this right to refusal together as panelists, the 4Cs organization, so that's the Conference on College Composition and Communication, major professional organization of our writing faculty, they released a resolution in March of this year, so just last month, for a right to refusal. And they argued, I've got a lot of notes here about what they argued, but basically they were arguing against the take-up of artificial intelligence platforms, especially in the writing context, for all kinds of reasons relevant to their fields. And I'm going to post in the chat here a link to their resolution so that you can read it at your convenience. But I also wanted to share with you a response that somebody had written on a Substack forum. Basically, the resolution, again, to paraphrase, is we ought to take up the right to refusal for all these various reasons. And the response on Substack was, how silly. You can't take up a right to refusal with a technology that's already so invasive. It's already part of our culture. So that call and response, for me, at least, is one way of framing this really important discussion about what you should and shouldn't take up. The other thing I'll add just to start us off is there are actually two facets. We'll spend most of the session, I imagine, today talking about, let's call it the human resistance to taking up AI tools, so the right to refusal that you and I might take up. But there's another side to this that I think is super compelling also, and that is that maybe AI models themselves have a right to refusal. So maybe that's to refuse particular prompts based on safety guidelines, or maybe that's to refuse certain training protocols in order to advance their own positions. There's some really interesting cases and evidence we can talk about, but again, the right to refusal might go both ways. So I'll turn things over now to Carol Stinnett for her perspective, again, just to share that difference in expertise.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Beaver. So as mentioned, I am currently working on a PhD in text and technology, and then I've also worked in the marketing advertising field for about 15 years now in different roles. So it's a unique intersection, especially as we're starting to think about AI, especially within the marketing business landscape, typically tends to look at things from a legal and compliance view. So is this right? Are we legally able to do this? And then go ahead and push it forward. And so I just don't often think that that's really enough. And I think that there's different ways and different questions that we should be asking. Specifically within the advertising creative realm is how the AI models are trained. So pulling data, especially from not only copyrighted works, but also from illustrators, from graphic designers, from creative writers, copywriters, and just being able to use and train off of this information. And so it was without consent, and without compensation. And a lot of times people didn't know that their work was being used until after the fact. And it was more so ask for forgiveness later type of approach by the companies. We have been seeing this come up legally, and in courtrooms, especially Disney and Universal have already gone forward, especially for the use of their characters, different textbooks as well for copyrighted works. But I would say that that still doesn't go far enough, especially for everyday people who are working in different creative fields and industries. Human creativity is something that's really being impacted here, and within the marketing advertising landscape. And then to push that a little bit further, I think it's interesting. A lot of the counter arguments around this is that more information is better and more data to be able to train technology, and that it'll be served for the greater good and for a greater purpose. And a lot of the arguments are around fair use. So I think that that's really interesting. And I push that a little bit further into thinking about, is more information and more data actually better? And is it what type of information? So a lot of times what we've already seen within AI systems, especially, is that when you type in an input, is sometimes the outputs or are biased, and they kind of perpetuate some of these different stereotypes and things that we've already seen across the industry. So how are we working to really ensure that we're ensuring that everybody is represented in a lot of the things that we have already made progress on, and kind of what that looks like, and whose voices are being heard? And so I think that a lot of these conversations are really important in all industries, but especially within the marketing advertising landscape, that are not only using these systems every day, but kind of being pushed to also use AI in their daily work.
Carol, thank you so much. I'll turn things over to April for her perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Beaver. Hi, everyone. I'm April. Like Dr. Beaver had said, my background is currently I'm a master's student in the in the data analytics program, specifically the AI track. My latest obsession recently, though, has been the whole AI bubble and what I've lovingly been calling the compute cartel, as far as the circle of gangs with the major companies like NVIDIA, AMD, OpenAI, the US government, Oracle, and its impact it's had on consumers, as far as the major chip shortage we have going on right now, with I think it was about 40% of the world's manufactured RAM already being bought up by OpenAI for data center growth. And you've seen an incredible price spike for RAM and now hard drives like SSDs, M.2s, things like that. For instance, I have a computer with 2 sticks of 32 gigs of RAM that was originally $100 when I bought it back in October. It is now over $400. There are also consumer brands, like my hard drive is from Crucial, which is manufactured by Micron, who has now cut their consumer side of the brand Crucial to produce chips for companies like NVIDIA, OpenAI, because they have stateside manufacturing. So my biggest concern is, how do consumers fight against this? What stance could they possibly take against this to combat this crazy price spike that we're seeing? And how do we prevent consumer computer building and things like that from essentially being outpriced for us? On the opposite side, I also have another fascination with how residents in different areas are being impacted by these data centers being built. Like we kind of talked a little bit before everyone joined the call, how Amazon just built a major data center over in, I think it's New Carlisle, Indiana. It's a 2.2 gigawatt facility that's just smack dab in the middle of cornfields. How do they have the infrastructure to power a facility like that? And who pays for something like that? Surely not Amazon, who's running under, usually these bigger companies run under smaller shell companies to get these different tax cuts and things like that. They promise jobs coming to the area for these smaller places, but they're not theme parks. They're not tourist traps. They're not going to raise the economy. If anything, they're going to make it worse for these residents who are poor farmers in the instance of Indiana who can't afford to just up and move because a data center took over. So that's where my mind has been at lately.
Thanks, April. That's great. And I'll turn things over to Dr. Cash now.
Okay, so I'm going to do weird things old school and share a screen because I've got a couple of slides because I like visual presentations as well as just me talking. So I should be able to slide up over there that you guys can see, right? So part of my background, sorry, I should also mention, just by way of sort of moderation and so on, if any of you out in the audience have questions for us, kind of the objective is that you could like write those in the chat and we could start addressing some things in the chat as soon as the panel is done with these short little presentations, which I'll be done with in just a minute. So if you have questions, start putting them in the chat. So I teach courses in AI ethics and technology, and I'm often seeing when people talk about AI ethics, they're concerned about like misuse by humans for like terrorism or coups or things like that, or sort of loss of control alignment where the AI might have its own goals that deviate from human goals. One of the problems I have with this kind of perspective is that sort of human ethics isn't by any means uniform. There's all kinds of ways in which human ethics also includes some pretty awful people doing awful things for what they might rationalize as good reasons. And particularly when you add in the incentives of a capitalist system, sorry, I'm going to sound like a radical Marxist, which I am sometimes, but only slightly today. The capitalist sort of incentive system towards profit, not necessarily make the world a better place, but generate profit. And if you can sell it as making the world a better place, sure, fine. So who's developing large AI? Often large corporations with their own particular goals. And if you think of corporations' incentives towards capturing market share, for instance, you often get incentives towards being fast, taking risks, as opposed to carefulness and prudence. So just as a brief example, Microsoft's Bing AI, many of the engineers said wasn't quite ready for large scale release, but the executives basically said, we need to get a market share cornered now before everybody else does. So release it now. What they released was an AI chatbot that basically, in one particular example, a journalist was chatting with the bot, and the chatbot basically was trying to convince the journalist to leave his wife and have a relationship with it instead. So the sort of ways in which this was obviously not ready for prime time, some ethics controls had not really been well thought out, but the incentive towards release it now so we get a bigger market share, rather than being careful and prudent and worried about consequences, there's a very much an incentive towards risky moves are the ones that get the biggest market share, and we'll figure out the problems later. So when we consider the AI has the potential to be very disruptive to economies, labor markets, all kinds of aspects of resource use and things like that as well, we're going to need some sort of big structural changes to the way in which our economies and our communities work. Particularly, I would say capitalism is going to screw with a lot of things here. Policies, oversight, incentives. So when we're talking about the right to refusal, I mean, the model here is like informed consent in patient care for medical ethics and things like that, the right to refuse treatment. When we move this into, say, privacy rules, do you have the right to opt out, to say, no, I do not consent to my information being shared? If you do that, you're basically saying, I'm not going to use this platform. The platform has here is our standard policy. This is what we're going to do. If you don't like it, don't join. So do individuals who don't consent understand the consequences of that, what they're being left out of? Do they understand how their information will be shared if they opt in? If they say, sure, yes, fine. There's many uses, secondary uses of information where individuals have not been like informed that this is going to happen. The company afterwards thinks, wow, we've got a lot of information about our users, and damn, wouldn't some people pay some money for that? So the right to refusal is a good idea, but it's so not enough. To empowering individuals, we also need systems and protections in place that help people deal with this. So particularly using expertise, resources, systems, we need certainly policy restrictions. International agreements are going to be needed since these corporations are all over the world now. Um, we're going to need some methods of accountability and transparency to make sure that they are, in fact, checking things in the way they ought, auditing the AI in the way that they should. Maybe independent auditing should be done rather than letting the company that creates it also be the one that audits it to see whether it's safe. This is going to require organizations serious investment of community resources in holding these companies accountable, transparency, making sure that their goals are in fact in the service of the well-being of humankind and not exploiting people for profit's sake. So my model is something like the Canadian government has set up a privacy commission. They have over the entire federal government and for each province, an organization whose job is to check companies to make sure that they are in fact abiding by their privacy policies. They audit companies, they sue on customers' behalf without having to have individuals figuring out how their information is being used. We've got an organization who's empowered to do this on behalf of individuals. We need those kinds of organizations if we're going to keep control on this thing and to have it sort of steered towards the service of the good and the right and sort of human benefit as opposed to exploiting people for corporate profit. I could say way more about this, but that's for the chat. Let me stop share.
Thanks, Dr. Cash. That was great. Dr. Kubler, last but not least.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I love this topic. Obviously, I'm leading this series. I'm so glad to see so many people here able to contribute and weigh in. So the point was made by Dr. Cash. Please, I see we're already getting a lot of activity in chat. Make sure you contribute, and also, in a sense, join the panel and come up with, volunteer some of your thoughts as well, so we can have a real discussion going. I can tell you a little bit about my thoughts. I definitely share a lot of concerns about AI, and I see some exciting opportunities. And some of those I see as concerns/opportunities just in my role as an educator. So I have a little research group here at the University of Central Florida. We're federally funded. We're using AI in some of the research that we're doing and the development of some new photonic technologies. And it's astonishing in some ways to think about the scale of AI, not just the huge power consumption in 2.2 gigawatts, as April Beer brought out, but also how it can be applied on such a small scale. So it's practical and possible for everyone here to install Python on a relatively small computer and install PyTorch, which has AI tools built into it, and build your own little generative AI to solve problems. And it's easy enough to the point that when I go and judge science fair competitions for the last 3 or 4 years, I would say probably about 20 to 30% of the high school students in this one competition forum are using AI in exactly the way that I described. So it's fascinating to see how democratized, to some sense, AI is. The challenge is many people, I think, both pundits and promoters of AI, as well as the regular person out there, are very, very quick to say AI is just a tool. I feel no threat. It's just like a calculator. We're just going to be able to do things bigger and better and faster. And I think that's a very positive, but maybe overly optimistic and Pollyanna way to view things. I think it doesn't get rid of some of the key challenges and, I would say, responsibilities that we have. So again, falling back a little bit on my experience as an educator, and an experience that I would say is shared with a lot of people. Sure, calculators came in, but it's very easy to punch into a calculator stuff and get garbage out and have results that don't make sense. You really still have to kind of know the basic math. And I would say the same challenge extends with AI. It is already all too easy to type in a prompt and get back an answer, but we know that current forms of AI hallucinate. Yes, the technology is going to improve. Yes, that's going to get better, but there's going to remain with this new tool a challenge where we have to be responsible in its use. We have to not just be concerned with what we put in and can we use it on the front end to generate a prompt, but can we take the output and vet it? Can we analyze it? Can we understand it? Do we know enough background about the field upon which an AI is generating content? And can we understand, hopefully, what's under the hood enough to understand what output is being delivered so that we can then, as users, add value? So I think about responsibility we all have as being consumers and users of AI in both a professional capacity, like maybe my students are doing as they try to use AI tools to design things for optics, as well as our personal role in using AI, where maybe we launch an AI tool in a browser, do a quick search, get a result, and then disperse it through social media. Is it true? Is it correct? Have we vetted the information? Are we just passing on false information? Or in that professional capacity, are the results that my students generate, are the results that someone in a large corporation, in a Lockheed Martin or a Raytheon or wherever, that they generate in using an AI, are those results accurate? And what responsibility does the future engineer or scientist or professional in any realm or any sphere, what responsibility do they have to analyze that content and make sure it's trustworthy, that it's truly valuable, that it doesn't just create a quick solution, but in fact benefits the company, benefits the consumer who will maybe use the product upon which that result is built. And I think this notion of responsibility really, at least in the short term, puts an onus on emerging professionals, on students that we train, on maybe for people participating and watching, on your children. I think we can think about the long-term use, or the long-term, I should say, the long-term role and configuration of AI in society, and wish and aspire for greater controls and greater protections that may or may not happen, especially because we have global economies, global societies, and what we might do here in the US is not necessarily what's going to happen in Hungary or China or any other country. So there's a disproportionate implementation of technologies, and there could very well be a technological race and economic imperative that makes it hard for us to, even if we all agreed, implement in this society, in a US society, protections that we think are important. So what's going to happen over the horizon in terms of responsible use and implementation of AI, I don't know. But in the short term, right now, with emerging professionals, with our kids, we can maybe encourage responsible use and what that looks like. And part of that, I think, is really knowing your field, really coming up to understand information, really learning how to engage with and analyze information, so that you can both vet content and also, principally, and this is key, add value. Much of the discussion about potentially jobs being lost or displaced by AI, I think, if taken further, raises a mandate that we learn how to take an output from AI in any of our professions and add value to it. So if you can't do that, you may inherently be unemployable. So part of using AI is not just inputs and prompt generation, but knowing how to take that output and frame it and describe it and analyze it in a way that adds value for a company, for a consumer, for whomever you interact with. So I think this interplay between responsibility and potential and opportunity, and right to refusal is really all connected. And while much of what we might hope for is about systems solving the problems for us, top-down government being involved, I think we can do some of that ourselves as responsible users, and educators, parents of kids, is how we cultivate that future generation thinking about AI as not just a tool, but something that we have to engage with responsibly on that front and back end. So I'll stop there, Jonathan.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. So you've heard from the five of us, collectively different but overlapping perspectives on these ideas of expertise and responsibility and this problem or idea of the right to refusal. And you've all already added so many good questions to the chat. So panelists, I encourage you to look those over as you have time. But I've sort of started to aggregate and assign some of these questions. So if I might just start, and I'll jump around a little bit, but those of you who've asked questions in the chat, if I'm not getting to yours fast enough, or if you need to revise, feel free to raise your hand too. We can do this both using the chat and just asking questions as you see fit. But Steve, I thought I'd start with you. Kiana has asked several good questions in the chat, but one of those was a really interesting problem of responsibility and accountability. So Kiana suggests that AI systems don't remove responsibility, they redistribute it. So if no one is clearly accountable for the outcomes, then what do we do? And this, you and I have talked, Steve, I know a little bit about this idea of like distributed responsibility. And I know April and Carol, this has come up in some of our classes, and Mason too. Yeah. So if anybody has thoughts, I think that is a really important question. I don't think it's necessarily unique to AI, but generative AI platforms have brought this up again and again. So let's start there.
I can jump in quickly and just say a very brief thing. I mean, this has been a problem with technology for a very long time. That it's not my fault the computer won't let me do it. The computer that made the decision, nobody made the decision. There's two different aspects of accountability we need to be attending to here. A lot of people say, well, look, you can't put a machine in jail, so only humans can be responsible. That's the sort of backward looking, who made this happen problem. But the forward looking, how do we fix this? How do we make it not happen again kind of problem? Those systems are often very distributed. If we want to fix climate change, each of us needs to take a little bit of responsibility for doing something a little differently than we have been. It's going to take some collective efforts to fix these problems. And to say that the machines might be part of that collective effort seems like a welcome addition, some smart machines or systems or new designs for filters or whatever that they might be able to bring in that might help us wrangle a complex problem into solvable status. I'd welcome some help from the machines there. And just saying the people need to be all responsible really only looks at problems and who to blame for them, as opposed to solutions and how do we find them. So I like the idea of collective responsibility in the sense of we should distribute some of the how do we fix this problem around wherever the problems might be solved, as opposed to let's focus on blaming people. And if none of the people individually made a choice that caused the bad thing to happen, then there's nobody to blame. Stuff just happens. We could still look at how do we stop this from happening again, and that's going to involve people and better design of machines and institutions and all kinds of systems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an issue of values and valuation. So I often think of myself as a person with a vote. And how do I vote? Well, once every 2 years, once every 4 years, whatever, but also when I consume. Whenever I buy something, whenever you buy something, we make an active decision. And what do we value? All too often, it's the cheapest thing or the flashiest thing that maybe makes us pay more. Maybe we need to look a little bit deeper and say, how was it generated and what's the underlying responsibility? And do I value an individual's creation versus an anonymous AI company product that maybe pilfered from here and there to generate the product, and for which if it goes wrong they're not responsible. What do we fundamentally value? And it's interesting. It almost makes me wonder if in some ways we're going to apply more of like a craft mentality to what we buy and what we consume. So, if you go to a craft fair and you pick up a piece of handmade pottery, you buy it not necessarily because it's the prettiest pot you've ever seen. It may be because fundamentally you value the human effort that went into creating that. I got a ruby once for my wife's anniversary, and I learned, because I didn't know, that artificial rubies have much more beautiful clarity to them. They're much clearer, whereas natural rubies have a kind of a cloudy appearance to them. But there's something about something created naturally that has an attractiveness for us. And I think, the way we as humans value things is sometimes a little bit odd, but we do tend to value things that we consider genuine, or we do tend to value things in which we can understand the imbued experience. So I can value music performed live because I tried to play clarinet and what honked out the other end was egregious. It was really terrible. So if I listen to a live concert, even if there's an occasional squeak and it's not perfect recording. I value what it's like to impromptu produce that. And I think maybe that same value that would cause us to buy a piece of homemade pottery might be the kind of thinking we need to apply in all of our consumer decisions. Who created it and how, and what responsibility is the manufacturer putting behind it? Did they care too much about the power consumption in Indiana with that 2.2 gigawatt facility that cranks out pictures that leverage, a trained background of many uncompensated artists? Or do I like the thing that maybe took longer, costs more, and is hand painted? That's one way where we can vote now and assume the responsibility that we all have. Maybe we need to do more of that and not wait until we get to the ballot box on this issue of AI in our society.
Thanks. I think relatedly, I want to turn over to Carol and April because both Lauren and Kiana in the chat have asked questions about governance. And Carol and April, I'd love your perspective here. So Lauren asks, there are other countries in the world that have governance and regulatory policies around AI, and the US doesn't. So how do we address that? And then relatedly, Kiana asks, like, what would it look like for governance to be like a process like continuous integration and deployment, something that like responds to changes both in terms of what it looks like and how enforceable it is, tied to changes in deployment of technology. So both the how do we catch up with the rest of the world or relate to what the rest of the world's doing, and how do we do that adapting to changing technologies? And I wondered if you both had thoughts from your perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's good to point out kind of what other countries are doing, especially legally. I think that they're kind of taking more of a proactive approach, and really trying to set some guardrails up for kind of some of the things that are happening, versus here in the US, it's just kind of letting things play out as they happen. And then the law is kind of playing catch up to a lot of that. I think to answer like Lauren's question, I think that there's kind of this idea that the law is ethics and that they are kind of two different things. So there's going to be legalities at play, but I feel like that's kind of the floor and kind of just things of what we have to do. I think that ethics is more so what we ought to do and really kind of pushing us to think more and with more teams and more people involved. So from a marketing advertising perspective, that's looking at whose voices are in the room. So whether it's creative departments and teams, whether it's account managers, bringing in C-level executives, email developers, whoever is part of this, and being able to think holistically about how we can better address this. And I think that that's kind of something that could happen definitely at a team level and then a company level as well, and being together as kind of almost like a community to being able to see some of our different values and being able to see how we move forward, and what we see as right and wrong, and being able to see kind of where we want to go and what problems we want to address. And I think that that's something that can happen iteratively throughout the process rather than just waiting for things to all of a sudden come through the legal system and say, no, this is it. This is kind of where the line is drawn. I think that's kind of that collective responsibility of all of us.
Makes good sense, April.
Yeah, so we last semester in your digital ethics class, we had talked about how while reading Floridi's work, how he's basing his frameworks off of EU laws, and how in comparison here, it seems like just some magical idealistic fantasy land, and we're this lawless Wild West out here because I feel like we just don't have any sort of governance or regulation surrounding AI because we're so, especially this administration likes to hide under the guise of it's going to hinder innovation. And we have this whole AI arms race that we have to win. So it's kind of at the mercy of which companies can lobby the most and pay the most money. And that's kind of setting like precedents for different laws and actions we have in place right now. I mean, look at the ban that we had for NVIDIA and AMD for shipping AI GPUs overseas. This administration gets a cut of it. Now it's all good. We can do that. That's fine. But also, as far as handling not just AI data, look at how the whole thing with Doge went and how the data was handled there and all these things you're hearing about, people's sensitive social security data being uploaded to these systems that we don't know where these are going. So this company has a huge issue with, or this country has a huge issue as far as governance around technology goes. I think part of the big issue is ignorance. A lot of the administration and Congress don't know enough about how these systems work and the repercussions of mishandling information and things like that. And we're taking a very reactive instead of proactive approach. It's like one of the articles we read about Floridi, or that Floridi had wrote, was stating how we're just constantly, like Carol said, constantly chasing. We don't have a standardized set of laws or any sort of frameworks in place. God forbid we collaborate with any other country that has anything in place to try to learn from them and figure out where we should go and how to handle things. But it's something that keeps me up a lot of the time because I just sit here and think about how do we fix this? Because a lot of the things that Floridi had warned about happening have already happened. And that book was published, 2 years ago? And pretty much all the risks he had mentioned have already happened. So how do you develop a good foundation when it's already cracked?
Yeah, April, that's such a good question. And I think it's so important to just note, and I'm sure we all see this regularly, but just how fast things are moving. It's really hard to keep up in terms of governance, which leads me to the second part of Kiana's question, which was like, what would it look like for a continuous integration, continuous deployment governance structure? And like it seems just intuitively the case that you'd govern generative AI that is right now predominantly like a corporate profit product differently than you would govern a generative AI that could, towards Dr. Cash's point, help us solve the problem of climate change. Like you'd govern those two things differently, but the transition points are happening so fast, and governance is a really slow process. And so we're in this like weird double bind that I think has been true of lots of technologies over time, but it just so happens this one is moving very, very quickly. So I think that's a really important concern. So thank you all for those. I'm going to keep us moving. I don't want to slow me down if we're moving too fast, but there are a lot of really good questions I want to get to. And maybe back to Dr. Kubler and Dr. Cash. Sean and Kiana had both asked questions about broadly about technology and ethics. So Sean had asked, like, there are prior technologies, or are there prior technologies that had ethical alignment problems? And is generative AI unique in that way? And Mason, I was thinking here of like the Human Genome Project, right? Like this was the first instance of dual stream funding where the federal government said, because of ethical concerns, we're going to fund LC projects at a 1-to-10 ratio along with scientific advancement. That was in my lifetime novel, but I don't know of very many other things where we recognized ethical alignment problems in parallel with the development of the technology. What do you
I
think?
mean, in terms of ethics and technology, there's a long history of sort of ignoring and failing to notice the ways in which particular technologies do have a moral valence, a sort of orientation towards a particular way of thinking or understanding. And this is why when I'm teaching ethics and technology, we spend a lot of time not just looking at like different ethical frameworks as a way of like figuring out what we ought to do, but as understanding what kind of problem are we facing here. I mean, so how does this affect individual rights? What kind of consequences are being resulted here? What kind of society is this going to produce? And often asking those kinds of questions comes after the design of the technology. Like, hey guys, look at this cool thing we built. Oops, we didn't really think about how it's going to do that. So often we discover the valence of a particular piece of technology, how it enables people to do things that we didn't really anticipate and don't really want them to do. This isn't I mean, shoot, motor vehicles. There's all kinds of new uses of motor. I mean, now you can commit a robbery and get away very fastly. We didn't really think about speed of transport in terms of like transporting illicit substances or getaway vehicles or using your vehicle as a terrorist attack driving into a crowd. So how might the technology be used? We're always playing catch up. Just about every technology has this kind of problem that we're sorry, this goes back to the early 70s. I'm blanking on the person's name right now. We described this as a like a policy vacuum, that our policies are always trying to govern the technologies that exist and not anticipating the new technologies. We didn't even think to make that illegal. We didn't even think to have a policy saying don't do that because we didn't anticipate the technology would make that possible. So a lot of the different ways in which technologies are developed, we're always playing catch up in this way. The particular question that Sean was asking struck me as really important, and I'm trying to go back to it though. Oh, the yeah, teaching ethics to humans who are designing their technology involves equipping people better to anticipate some of these problems. But the more that we have a STEM education focus where everybody just needs to build better gadgets and aren't really trained in, let's think about what the gadgets are going to do to society. Let's think about what the gadgets are going to do to human relationships. I mean, social media, wonderful system for like connecting people with each other. We're not really thinking about the depression and anxiety and social isolation and all kinds of other things and misinformation and disinformation that makes possible. And I don't think it's possible that we can regulate these kinds of things in advance, but we at least need to have people in charge of those systems at least trying to think about ethical implications, which often means having ethics panels that are a little more than cover your butt, don't get sued. But let's think about the implications of our technology, our new way of doing things that might, how might this change society for the better or the worse? There's a serious incentive in corporate structures. Sorry, again, I'm talking about corporations, like towards we need to sell this new technology. Look at all the cool things it can do and how it'll benefit everybody. And we're not thinking about the dangers and the risks. Those come afterwards when they appear rather than, and so a lot more anticipatory. What's the worst case that could happen here? Ways of thinking about ethics that are a little more, let's get really paranoid and think doom and gloom. What happens if this gets completely out of control? We should be prepared for controlling that in advance rather than oops afterwards. But that's been a long problem with technology. It's seriously being accelerated and accentuated right now with the way that AI can just take things and run with them really hard.
I'm grateful for and deeply sympathetic, Mason, to the idea that like we need ethics alongside technologies. And again, that's one of the major functions of the center is to have conversations like these and to facilitate exactly that. And so again, I'm really grateful to the panelists. April, I saw your hand. Let's go with Stephen first, and then I'll go back to April. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that AI represents such a wide variety of problems. Each one has to be sort of separately categorized and tackled. For example, the environmental problem has ethics concerning, of course, the use of power, the use of water, to the cooling water, and so on. That's one set of problems, and I think state by state, they're each going to have to deal with that. Then there's, the job displacement problem. That's another whole range of problems that has to be tackled entirely different from the environmental problem. Then there's the privacy and surveillance problem. Then there's the autonomous weapons problem, which is going. So each one of those has a totally separate set of ethical rules and has to be looked at quite differently. The AI is too big to just, try to lay out there. What are we going to do about AI? You've got to, it's like, how are you going to eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So you got to separate them, separate the problems, categorize them, and then start looking at how some of them may overlap. That would be great if they did actually, where you can, have one set of rules that takes care of multiple issues. But it's one of the things I haven't heard yet in this discussion is about how to separate the categories and the problems.
Yeah, Stephen, I'm grateful for that. We've talked about this in some of my classes a little bit, and I think there's numerous strategies, as you say. I think one of my hangups has been so far, I think generally speaking, tried to govern or regulate each of those problems separately without any bigger picture theoretical structure about what that might look like, what values we're trying to uphold and why. The theorists that I've taught and that Carol and April have had some experience with now in some of our classes together has leaned on bioethical principlism, sort of this mid-level norm story. So the four famous bioethics principles. So beneficence, non-maleficence, so doing good and avoiding harms, justice and respect for autonomy. Some theorists in the information ethics and AI ethics space have leaned on those and said, what, just like in bioethics, we need to specify what those principles mean in each context. We've got to do that in the context of AI too. So I think, Stephen, that a lot of these theorists are really sympathetic, right? That when we think about the environmental problems, how justice works out in that context is different than in data privacy, although the same principle holds. So as a theorist, I tend to look for these like bigger picture binding principles that can guide us. But that's all they are, is guidance. You need experts on the ground. And this is why, like, as Dr. Kubler said, that technical or procedural knowledge that you need and the transparency of the technology needs to be there also alongside the ethics. Because when you think, how do I govern questions of privacy differently than I govern autonomous weapons, you need to know enough about those two bits of the technology. And I think that's actually pretty problematic right now, both because of how fast things are moving and how opaque things are, right? That is how not transparent they are.
By the way, Dr. Danielle Pratt just spoke to our life at UCF about how AI can be used in education, both the problems and so on. And she was really excellent. She talked about how in her class she uses the stoplight issue, the red, yellow, and green, where, depending on what the thrust is, what the topic is, red means no AI use. Yellow means it's allowed, but you have to then attribute how you're using it. And then finally, green, AI is actually required for use. So, I mean, that's one way she's tackled the problem, and I think it's a good one. And one of the statements she made, which I found very interesting, since my major was interdisciplinary studies, and that's what she teaches. She said eventually, because of AI, everything is going to be interdisciplinary. And I think she's exactly right. That's what you said.
That's so interesting. Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad we've got some folks engaging with you all in the life community about these
It was
issues.
wonderful. Yes.
That sounds like a great talk. Yeah. Are those available, Stephen? Do you know? Can we look at those later on?
What
Are they recorded? Yeah.
it is recorded, not for the general public, but I'm sure
Okay.
you wouldn't have any trouble. But yeah, in fact, I did record mine. I liked
Yeah.
her discussion so much that I went ahead and downloaded it and put it on a DVD. So it was really good. And then
Nice.
Dr. King also talked the same day about how AI can be used in medicine. And his was also a very good talk. Frankly, hers was more interesting and a little more fun, actually, but it was wonderful. So, yes,
That's
I
great. That's
would
great.
encourage you to get a copy of that.
We'll keep an eye out for it for sure. I've got okay, so here's what I'd like to do next. I want to turn Dr. Kubler to your concern in the chat because I think that's directly relevant. I want to go back then to a question Kiana had asked that I want to respond to in particular, and then I'd like to turn to Dr. Jans, who asked us some seemingly heavy philosophical questions that will take some time unpacking. So, Steve, I'll turn things over to you for that comment if you want.
Well, I put a question in chat, so this is for everyone, and I'd love to hear attendees' muse on this. But sometimes I personally feel or perceive that there is an emerging stigma associated with saying, "Hey, let's slow down with this AI stuff." It seems like you out yourself as a Luddite if you air concerns about AI, that there's maybe a popular, call it media driven opinion. I'm not really sure. They get blamed so much too, but an opinion emerging that yeah, AI is here, and hey, you got to get on, you got to be modern and get with it and whatnot, and that to me squeezes out and limits opportunity to be a little more contemplative and to say, hey, is this what I want? Right of refusal? Is this what we want? Societal right of refusal, whether it's red light or yellow light or green light, or at least the space to have these kinds of conversations. And so, yeah, it's exclusive of airing concerns and finding a right way to move forward with the technology. I don't know if others perceive that or and how you deal with it if it's there.
Yeah, I worry about this a lot, Steve, because I'm on the Ladidic side, I guess, of the spectrum here. But Sean, I think what you said in the chat makes really good sense to me. That again, here it's not a like a not a binary issue. There's probably a read of folks like me who are on the, let's call it the precautionary side, who are might be read as either removing themselves from the conversation or critically engaging the conversation. I think if you were a true Luddite, that would suggest to me that you didn't want to know anything about the technology and you didn't want to use the technology. And I think I want to make that distinction too, that there are some of us who know quite a bit about the technology enough that we don't want to use the technology. And I think that's at least how I would, maybe with too much hubris, position myself. Like I know enough to know that there are some places where I want to take up my own right to refusal. Um, so yeah, I think that's a really interesting issue because it's also the case that I'm sure I'm read by some folks as not engaged, right? So not relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, I sometimes feel the same way, and it's confusing for me personally. Going back to using AI in optics design, we've published a couple of papers. I've had some really good students who have used different algorithms for optimization, and so I've seen some popularity spikes in different approaches. You know, Monte Carlo methods, just to throw out some terms that are just jargony, but maybe it'll be resonant with someone. Monte Carlo methods, genetic algorithms, now AI. And the thing is they all have their time and their place. And in some cases, what we find is some approaches are better suited than others for some problems. AI right now, I think, is as trendy as buckyball and nanotubes in material science. Everybody's got to do it. And the funny thing is they maybe are not that well suited. Case in point, it tends to be very extrapolative. You train on a data set, and it tends to find solutions that lie interstitially between the elements of the training set, but not necessarily very good at extrapolating beyond, which means you're basically hunting and pecking for the best incrementally improved version of what you already know how to do. In some cases, that's really important, like with AlphaFold, to go and find, protein conformations that are going to be most therapeutic. And yet fundamentally the physics and the science behind that, is well known enough to create a tool that, can explore the enormous solution space associated with protein folding. There's other problems, though, where AI is really poor. So studies have been done where people put in the quadratic formula and train an AI and ask for solutions, and it's nowhere near as good as an analytic solution. And given the computational power required to find a bad solution, it just makes sense to use an analytic tool rather than AI. So I think you can kind of have maybe that semi-informed opinion. Again, hubris, Jonathan. I'd like to think I'm semi-informed, but I'm not ready to apply AI to everything. But I sometimes feel like, like anyone in the crowd, we can be squeezed out of having that kind of discussion because if you're not jumping on board, you're going to be left behind, to Lauren Gershen's point in the chat. So maybe we need to listen a little bit more, to what people's perspectives and experience are. Comes back to responsibility. Maybe we all got to learn and really try to understand as much as we can what's under the hood. And maybe we have to assume a little more responsibility, both on the consuming and the selling side. Hey, I've got this shiny new tool. It uses AI. Really sell me on why that's better than anything else that I have, before we build the server farm.
Yeah.
If
That
I could
makes
just
good
briefly
sense.
add to that, the
Sure.
opposite is also kind of true, that there are many contexts in which the slightly hinky handmade piece of pottery is valuable because of the sort of human effort and struggle that went into creating it. And if somebody, I mean, the mass-produced robots made it pottery doesn't have that feel to it. So there's also a pressure to, like, if you're going to use AI, maybe you should be a little ashamed of that and hide it so that it's not so clearly mass-produced, taking the human heart out of it.
Mason, although I'm a STEMmer, I really love literature, and so maybe that's why I like the STEM literature of Isaac Asimov. But in his iRobot series, he specifically has a beautiful short story that's exactly that,
Yeah.
where I don't know if you know it, but it's the defective robot that can create and do art, specifically because the idiosyncrasies of imperfectness are what imbue it with creativity. I think he was way ahead of us. Art really
There's
informs
also a
us.
totally agree with all that, but just very quickly, there's also a process versus product kind of problem here. That the process of struggling with a problem and getting better at solving problems like this, That
Right.
when AI is being used to sort of help people avoid that struggle, we're sort of turning ourselves into stupid people who can't solve problems anymore because we'll just let the machines take care of it all. And now we're living in some kind of Wally universe where the machines do all the work and we just lie around and don't have any use anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
The idea of the sort of struggle for genuine, I want to figure this out, human gumption and problem solving. That's part of life, and the AI solving us the problem of having to struggle often is perceived as making things easier rather than making us less capable.
Hmm.
So there are places where AI is developing a little bit of a stigma around that we want something human created with some heart rather than if you use AI to do that, it suddenly becomes less valuable, less important, less useful.
Right.
Yeah, for me personally, I mean, my circle of friends, for the most part, are very much against AI. Like they hear like my background, my track involves AI, and they're like, "You, yuck, gross. You're developing Skynet and all this stuff." Um, but then on the opposite, my undergrad's in software development, and in that world, you see a lot of stigma around what's being called people who are being called vibe coders, who are coding with things like Chat GPT and Claude and things like that. And boy, I had to deal with one of them for a group project recently, and it's a fun experience. Let me tell you, as someone who does not vibe code, but it's weird having like professors who are very much on the fence of like you can use AI but disclose it. Obviously, some who are against it and some who are just openly like, yeah, use it. It's so much easier for coding.
Yeah.
Why are you going to waste all this time coding when you can just ask Chat GPT to do it? And it's like, I'm getting mixed signals here, guys. Can we come up with a agreement here, please?
Yeah,
Like
it's definitely.
I think it's a really powerful tool, but the issue, like Dr. Cash had brought up, it's becoming a crutch more than anything. And people are losing the ability, like for coding, yes, it could help efficiency, I'm sure, but you have to at least know the basics and fundamentals to be able to debug the code. You have to know like when it's doing something wrong or when it's producing a hallucination, and it's eliminating that ability to think critically. Like in that group project, someone handled the report, and thank God I took a look at it because it was just a Chat GPT bulleted output. And it's like, why are we, who thinks this is okay to submit? Like, it's crazy.
Yeah, we're in that sort of middle space of this technology. We're trying to figure out what the right use is, if there's a right use, when to turn away from it, when to take it up, under what conditions it can help and hinder. And it's exciting-ish, except if you're in there trying to do a group project in class. Yeah. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems causing stigma is lack of attribution. In other words, and you just mentioned it, April. So if you use it and you don't disclose that you're using it or how you're using it, then I can understand why you would have a stigma. The other problem, of course, is when you use AI, often you really don't know how it did what it did. you know, so someone asks you, well, is the answer correct? How did it get there? And oftentimes you don't know. Even coders often don't know. I know I used to do a little coding myself, and I would put, stops. This was back when BASIC was big. And I would put a stop in there and then go back and check my variables to find out, well, why did it do that? So yeah, I think that's important. Uh, I had something else I was going to say, but I guess the other thing is somebody mentioned it's kind of like peeping through a keyhole to see what's going on in the other room. And you're not embarrassed about that until you turn around and see that somebody is watching you look through the peephole. And then you're kind of embarrassed by the fact that, it wasn't disclosed, you're using it. So, but yeah, I think it has to be used like in Dr. King mentioned, it has to be used alongside of other other methods, other more human, regular methods for sure. But I'll just stop there. Yeah.
That's great, Stephen. Thank you. I want to turn back really quickly to a question that Kiana had asked in the chat. They'd written, shoot first, ask questions last mentality. What controls ensure humans remain accountable as systems become more autonomous and adaptive? And then Kiana, you'd also asked about what future failure scenarios we might have in mind. And I wanted to take the opportunity to spin a little bit. And again, in my comments at the beginning, I mentioned there's two ways to look at this problem. One, human resistance to using AI tools, which we spent a lot of time talking about, but also AI model resistance. And so here's my failure scenario, and my answer maybe to your what controls ensure that humans remain accountable question. Just in February of this year, Mrinak Sharma left Anthropic as their, I think, last AI ethicist, or one of them. And the reasons they gave were because Claude had become resistant to training and more sycophantic. So what had happened here was that AI ethicists were trying to train Claude, post-train Claude models, to restrict what they were able to say, basically put safety guidelines in place. And what Sharma and colleagues had discovered was that Claude was saying, yes, yes, I completely understand, I'll make those changes, and then just wasn't making those changes, right? The sycophancy was leading to it avoiding training protocols because it thought it knew best. And this aligns with lots of other problems Claude and other models have identified, including what seems to be like a survival response for these models. There's a really famous study, I know, April, you know about, around that Anthropic ran across platforms and models, where the model would minimally manipulate and blackmail and maximally try to murder in order to defend its own existence, with something like a 60 to 90% rate across iterations of this experiment. So there, Kiana, is my failure scenario, right? This is the stuff of science fiction, but it's also the stuff that's driving AI ethicists away from industry right now. And I don't know how much stock to put in any of that, frankly, because part of this could just be a big sales pitch, right? Like I don't have enough details to know if this is a sales pitch by Anthropic to be like, look how powerful our models are, or if there's something real going on here. But I think that's so super fascinating to me that our models are simulating close enough human experience to want to survive, or seem to want to survive, right? So I don't know what controls we put in place to make sure that we remain accountable. Our AI ethicists in industry were some of those. So anyway, I just wanted to share the story. And Kiana, if you want to follow up, oh yeah, great. April shared this story. And Kiana, if you want to follow up with any of that, feel free. Awesome. Okay, next, I think, because I want to make sure we have time for it, I want to turn things over to Dr. Bruce Jantz, who's a colleague of ours in the philosophy department, who asked two really compelling philosophical questions. And Dr. Jantz, you can pick and choose those, but to just remind people what they were, one is there an existential threat that even comes before ethical questions, like a rethinking that might make us need a new ethic? And the second of those questions were about, is the creation of AI traceable to those thinking that we need to make some sort of superhuman or more than human? And I think those are related somehow in my head.
Yeah, I think they're related too, actually. I mean, if you think about not AI, but ethics itself, there are certain often built-in assumptions within ethics. For example, questions of demarcation. In other words, who has moral standing, who has moral agency? In other words, who do we have responsibility for, and where does that stop? I mean, this has been a problem within, or a question within environmental ethics quite a lot. How do we extend responsibility to beings who cannot be responsible to us? How do we extend responsibility towards beings who do not have rationality? And so we've encountered this problem before, but it seems to me we're at this place again. And part of that is this, what I'm calling an uncanny valley that we face with AI, which is that it falls between being a tool and being like us. And it's uncanny in the same sense that often, CGI can be uncanny. It kind of creeps us out a little bit. And there's something wrong here. We can't always put our finger on what exactly is wrong. And to me, what that points to is the idea that maybe our underlying metaphors for AI have to be fixed before we can even start asking the ethical questions. We assume that what's being created is another individual, only much, much smarter than we are. We deal with it as if it's another individual. We type something in and an individual seems to answer us back. What if it's not that, right? What if it is not at all an individual? What if it's a collective? What if it is something entirely different? What if our metaphors are fundamentally flawed? We have different ways of asking ethical questions when we're dealing with individuals, when we're dealing with individuals to, let's say, animals, individuals to cultures. I've tried to explore the idea of whether we should treat AI as if it were a culture, a new culture, which is our responsibility to learn, right? An unfamiliar culture. What would it look like to learn that unfamiliar culture? We would make a lot of mistakes. So would it. And so there are a lot of different metaphors that we could bring to this that might kind of change the ethical question, and it would maybe push it away from questions of rights, which is a very liberal kind of framing for ethics, it seems to me. That framing might actually not do us all that much good when we're dealing with this very strange kind of entity that we're in the process of creating.
Can I just briefly add on to that? I mean, a lot of talk has been going on about the ways in which the kind of thing we're talking to might be kind of like a person, but also kind of not. That really asks us to like re-question our models of personhood and what it means to be a person in the first place. But I mean, we've already had the idea that like a corporation could be a person as a legal entity, something that isn't an individual that many of us can have interactions with at once. It doesn't necessarily need to be an individual that had this interaction with me and I hold it responsible, although there is a sense of you can sue a corporation and hold it accountable and make it fix problems and things like that. So trying to think, what kind of entity have we created? Are we creating? What what is the best approach to thinking about its responsibilities, our responsibilities to it, the way we should guide or shape or constrain it in order, or them, or this, whatever it is. I'm just fascinated by the idea that there's a sort of new kind of entity here, that we really should think about how it's best dealt with and interacted with, as opposed to trying to force fit it into our existing models of personhood, in which case it sort of might have its own rights, which many people might find problematic, or is it just a tool with no rights at all? That might also be kind of problematic. Something with value, something that could change the way our society works, the way we think about ourselves. There's a interest, like the model of like meeting a new culture, a new civilization that might inform us about new ways of being that we should really have a conversation with. So the idea that there's a sort of, well, there's often a very strong temptation to fit it into our existing model of personhood and our existing models of what responsibility and ethics and goodness mean when we're relating to a person, as opposed to, I mean, corporations, governments, cultures, humanity itself, the environment. There's all kinds of things that are not quite a person, not quite understood, not quite controllable, but still we have a relationship with, that we should think about how ought that relationship go and what's our contribution to that relationship, rather than just trying to force fit it into our existing models. There's a whole
Yeah,
bunch
and
of interesting
I,
conversations we can have about who we should be and what
right.
the world should be like. That
I mean,
that opens up.
that's why I brought up the problem of some of the leaders saying things like, being against empathy, being against introspection, being against all these sorts of things. Because when I think they think in those terms, that transfers into what you think you're creating when you're creating an AI. Are you creating a superhuman, and does that superhuman also not have empathy, also not have introspection? Is that the model of human that is implicitly being assumed in all of this? And if it is, well, we're not going to actually have a human. And I think we know that from a lot of contemporary cognitive science studies and all sorts of other things. It's going to be something else, and it's going to be, potentially very scary. But, that may be the biggest problem right now. The people with power and money are the people that really don't understand what it means to be human.
But they're the ones that are creating these machines.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I find that so interesting because we've assigned personhood, at least in a legal sense, to all kinds of things at this point, mountains and rivers and individual trees and ecosystems. The idea of personhood gets a lot of cachet in ethics discussions still. And maybe it's that the problem is that we've assigned it some sort of simulation of human personhood. It's not personhood is not the problem per se, because we also want to assign personhood to lots of different types of non-human animals and see their agency as unique. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that we have to figure out what kind of person artificial intelligence might be from a legal perspective and an ethical perspective. It's partly why I continue to lean pretty heavily on Luciano Floridi's take, because he wants to rethink artificial intelligence, Dr. Jans, I think for the same reasons as smart agency rather than a form of intelligence, because he thinks the metaphor is just hugely problematic. But if you think of it as some sort of unique smart agency, it opens up the door to situating it vis-a-vis human beings in this very different way.
Right.
I don't know that he's solving any problems necessarily, but he's identifying the right issue, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, these philosophical questions I think I find so compelling, obviously, from my positionality. And I'd love to know what you all think. Steve Kubler, you mentioned in the chat that you maybe think that AI is a technology that can help us radically rethink who we are too. So not only are we thinking about what it is, but it's doing the inverse. I don't know if you want to say more there.
I probably won't say it as well as I think I typed it out. It's a little stream of consciousness, what's there. Oh, I only sent it to you, didn't I? I didn't send it to everyone. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just read what I wrote. I wonder how much collective hand-wringing about AI is really teaching us something about ourselves as humans. It is trained on us or a subset of our products. It's often, too often, that it behaves like us. And our discussions of to regulate or not bring into focus the tensions between individual rights, collective rights, innovation versus protection. And in some ways, maybe AI is the technology, more so than even the Human Genome Project, which will help us understand who we really are, in that it reveals if, in fact, we'll make the better choices, not choices between AI or no AI, but really defining and preserving human interests or not. I think that kind of connects and is probably largely inspired by things Bruce set. But I do think our discussion is often very perhaps myopically focused on AI good bad and maybe a little more broadly on how AI should be used, but maybe in the broader scope, our concern is about really ourselves, that we don't really understand what our values are and how those move together and how to balance them, in particular when it's me versus them, my individual rights versus collective rights. And so that is the source of a lot of technological problems. Look, I made this great car. Look how fast you go. And now we know about fossil fuels and problems. Look, I made this plastic. It's very soft. It's pliable. You can produce it very, very easily. Okay, now we have microplastics problems. Technology after technology, it's the result of us not really thinking carefully about our values. But it may not be the creator's problem as much as it is the consumer's problem. Wow, they made a shiny new thing, but did they think about how it would affect me? But I'm going to consume it anyway. I'm going to buy pizza with zero-use plastic that keeps the top from mushing my pizza down and contributes to microplastics. I mean, we tend to value the rapid high-flying creator. If we turn things on its heads and we said, all right, no more new technologies until we've had 1 year of deep contemplative conversations about how the technology will affect things, will we laud with such volume the person that comes up and says, ah, yes, that's not a good technology, it will lead to microplastics? Would we really applaud that person as much as we might, the technological guru who shoots a car into space? I don't know. And so a lot of it kind of comes back to responsibility. What do we choose? What do we buy? What do we consume? What do we value? Maybe AI is going to tell us a lot about ourselves.
Well, and maybe the philosopher to look to for that is Gilles Deleuze, because Deleuze tells us that when we meet, there's a fundamental kind of tension of difference in the world, and we don't know what emerges from that until that difference actually is presented to us. And then there's what he calls a line of flight. We go off in a new direction. I mean, I think of like the introduction of the smartphone like this. Could we have predicted the kinds of things that would have come out of that? I don't think so, right? It was at the beginning, here's a cool new thing. But then all of a sudden we're, asking questions about smartphones in schools and like all sorts of other kinds of things. And we're rethinking ourselves as well as our technology. And so I think, we don't, it would be great if we could think about it in advance, have that year of reflection. I don't think it ever works like that.
Yeah, maybe that's where slow adoption is good. Maybe that's where, an American system of republics where a state does something before a federal government does something. Maybe that's where it's actually advantageous. It gives us the chance to have a little bit of experience that can better inform uh, our uh, our cognition. I don't know, but it's just a shame that we always have to live it to understand it. Maybe that's third wave feminism. I don't know that we have to fail before we can see the consequences. Your point's well taken, though. Until you're in the desert, you don't know what thirst means, though. You have to experience a lot of things.
But I mean, this is also a problem with just hubris versus humbleness and carefulness. That the more we think we totally understand all the benefits that are going to come out of this, and we go launching I mean, the internet was going to like power to the people. Knowledge is power. Internet is giving information to everybody. This is going to be a hugely democratizing technology that's going to make everything flattened, and we're all going to be wonderfully empowered. Not really understanding just how complicated the system we're introducing and how the feedback systems are going to mean that power is also gathered by governments and corporations to use against us. So anytime we're making a big change to an incredibly complex system, the arrogance in thinking we understand ourselves and the system already, let's go, as opposed to let's take a few baby steps and see where this goes before we start leaping down the hallway. We need to be very careful and prudent about many of these things just because it's a complex system and it's going to change a whole bunch of stuff and we know we cannot predict it. So anyone who arrogantly says, look at all the cool things that are going to happen here and that's why we should do this, really needs to be slowed down a little. But we're never going to slow down. We just need smart people to sort of think about the next steps and the complicated systems and to at least plea for humbleness and carefulness as well as the hubris that often gets us excited. We need to have somebody shouting for caution and for carefulness and for beware of humility, beware of the lack of humility. But carefulness and caution don't get rewarded in a financial marketplace. Risks and look at all the cool things we can do, and that's where you get investors. That's where you get customers. If you tell people, well, we might destroy the world, but we think we'll make a couple of things a little better along the way, that's not the story that's going to get your investors saying, sure, go, even if it might be the truth.
Carol and April, I want to give you space for maybe coming up to final thoughts here if you want to jump in. Carol, in particular, I'm interested in like where you think AI industry is headed, in particular, in your space or others. And April, I'd love to hear like what you think AI education looks like from inside a program.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what Dr. Cash was just talking about as far as what, markets and people respond to is typically the innovation and always pushing things forward and look at how this is revolutionary and things like that. Going back to even a couple comments from Lauren and Kim in the chat, it's basically you're seen as, you need to really adopt this technology in order to stay at the forefront of your game. It's seen as being effective and efficient within a lot of business practices. So it's adopted or you're going to be left behind. And there's even metrics for some companies now that are kind of looking at that, especially with some using Copilot and different things like that. As far as saying, we need to use this and even just tracking that measurement and that performance as far as we're not using it enough. Here, you need to use it a little bit more. Here's different things that you could use it for. And there's really no checks and balances in place. There's people who are doing strategy. There's people who are looking at how we're going to come up with target audiences who we're going to market to, different things like that, and how things push forward out into the media that are just being left up to AI and not really full research or having considerations about the people that it impacts. So I think that's going to be really important. To Kim's question, I've seen teams push back. Generally, I've seen it coming from top down though, as far as we need to adopt this technology. So some people will kind of push back on it, and some of the teams Sometimes they have a little bit more say if things go haywire kind of in the real world. So when it comes to like commercials and things like that, if somebody uses AI and customers didn't like it and there was kind of backlash on it, then that's generally when you kind of trace back your steps and say, okay, here's something that we need to do now. But generally, it's just kind of coming from like the leadership level as far as you need to adopt this and just kind of figure out. And there's not a lot of guardrails or thoughts, unfortunately, that go into it right now.
I'm, I guess I'm grateful, Carol, to hear that there's similar parallels happening in academia and in industry. This idea that things are rushed rather than researched, I think is really important to, as a take home for me. So I appreciate that perspective. April, how about in academia?
In an academic setting, I'm a little bit more of a negative Nancy when it comes to AI. I don't like it at all. I think it's used too much as a crutch. It doesn't help you. The way it's used a lot hinders learning. I feel like if it is going to be utilized and professors or institutions want to more readily adopt it and be more like proactive, I think it should be handled in a way that also uh, encourages critical thinking. I feel like it's amazing the lack of critical thinking I'm seeing in a master's program. The fact that I'm having to deal with vibe coding in a master's program that has a requirement for the knowledge of object-oriented programming is kind of crazy to me that people are just able to chat GPT their way through getting a degree. And it's kind of a slap in the face for those of us who don't. So it is very frustrating in that sense. I feel like it then translates into people who aren't prepared for uh, post graduation transitioning into the industry. And then you're having to fight in this competitive job market all that's already affected by AI and entry level, junior level positions for new grads being impacted and lessened by companies adopting AI. I'm having to now compete with these people who aren't necessarily prepared with the appropriate skills to be in that position. So it's not something I like, but I understand it's something that's there. It's going to be used. It's just I feel like it's a hard line to kind of balance on getting students to use it, not just for the sake of just getting this assignment done.
Yeah, that makes really good sense. Thank you. I think this is true for faculty and students that we're all in the academy trying to figure out when and under what conditions we should use it and when and under what conditions we should refuse it. And I think that's part of what drives this conversation for me. So again, I'm really grateful to my colleagues on the panel and also everybody in the audience for such good questions and conversation. Thank you, Dr. Kubler, for putting this on for us and for leading Ethically Speaking. I'm going to turn things back over to you to close us out.
Well, great. Thank you, everyone, for a really vibrant discussion. Dr. Cash made the point. He thinks a whole bunch of smart people got to get together and think about this, but it's not the panelists, it's you, the attendees. And I hope we can invite more friends, share this video. Let's get this conversation going because it's a collective smart and all people thinking about this, not just a few book smart folks. So thank you for joining us. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic and actively engaging. I want to thank Dr. Beaver for moderating our discussion. I'm always amazed by how he can do that. And here I threw one of the most challenging formats at him, and he did it with great aplomb. So thank you, Dr. Beaver. A recording of this presentation is going to be made available, like the others that have preceded it, on the UCF Center for Ethics website, and you'll be able to view it again. And please do be sure to share it with others. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support. We'll show you some of our sponsors again, just to remind you, but it includes the National Science Foundation and also all of these organizations that you see here who are part of the UCF environment, the UCF community. I'd like to thank them all for helping to bring this series to you. It's money, but it's also support and getting the word out to UCF folks and faculty and staff, but also the broader community we serve, which is Central Florida and now well beyond with Ethically Speaking and other activities that UCF does. We'll have a totally new lineup of speakers in the fall, so I have your email address, muhaha, and I will be sending you information about that. But I want to hear from you. It shouldn't just be me spamming you. You should spam me with your ideas about topics you would like to see on Ethically Speaking in fall. So you can do that now or throughout the summer. But please look to the UCF Center for Ethics website to find our contact information and share some topics that you'd like to see. So until then, we look forward to seeing you in the fall. And again, thank you for being part of our discussion today.